Hello, I'm Teresa Piacentini, and welcome to this short film, short case study on the city of Glasgow. And it's a case study that focuses on resistance and solidarity. In this short recording, I am going to be looking a little bit about at Glasgow's history as a second city of empire. I'll briefly explore some of the narratives of resistance that shape the kinds of stories that Glasgow tells of itself. I'll also be looking at briefly some of the changes to the city in terms of refugee migration in the last 20 years. And we'll be looking at some of the policies that have shaped the experiences of people in the asylum process as they try to navigate life in Glasgow. And finally, we'll be looking at the kinds of emergent solidarities from the past 20 years, specifically in relation to refugees and people in the asylum process, so how these have emerged across the city. So really, to begin with, Glasgow as the second city of empire, it's a city that's been best known for its proud shipbuilding past, and it is a post-industrial city that in many ways is still struggling to come to grips with the impacts of deindustrialisation. Locating the city historically from the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, Glasgow as a workhouse became the second city of empire, so a crucial cog in the machinery of producing and sustaining empire. The city's merchants became wealthy from cotton and tobacco production in America, inevitably built on slavery and land dispossession. And many of the street names in Glasgow reflect this specific history. And when we talk about in Glasgow the famous Red Clydeside, Glasgow became known during the 19th and early 20th century when political radicalism amongst the working classes was at its peak of organisation. Rent strikes, labour movements and anti-war activity characterised the political character and energy of the city at this time. Mary Barber, who we can see on this slide, was a key figure here, a Scottish political activist, a local councillor and a magistrate. And she was closely associated with the Red Clydeside movement in the early 20th century, and especially for her role as the main organiser of the Women of Govan, who led the rent strikes in 1915. And arguably, Glasgow's story is one of solidarity, of do-it-yourself activism, of community amid adversity. And this historical context and certain moments are often evoked, sometimes taking on mythical qualities in the telling and retelling of the story of the city. And it is important, of course, to distinguish between these and the stories we would rather not tell. Glasgow is a city with a history of violence and sectarianism, poverty and ill health. And as well as being the city that renamed the square housing the South African Embassy in Glasgow to Nelson Mandela Place during the apartheid era, the city profited greatly from a slave trade. It is a city with a long history of migration, of welcoming Polish migrants during World War II, but also of anti-Irish racism. It is a city where Firsat Dag, a Turkish asylum seeker, was murdered in 2001 in a racist attack. Glaswegians often note that we're all Jock Thompson's bairns, that expresses a kind of egalitarian sentiment, but racism is very much a part of Glasgow's past as it is its present. And as Zandra Yeaman and Lou Deer explore and explain in this blog, which I've posted in the storyboard, about the 1919 race riots that went unmarked in the 2019 centenary celebration of the Battle of George Square, a story that is closely linked to empire and to racism. Glasgow is a city that has undergone rapid urban change in the last 50 years, and migration into the city is as part of that story, particularly in relation to asylum and refugee migration in the past 20 years. But before we can explore the experiences of people in the asylum process who are dispersed to Glasgow, we do need to think briefly about the immigration legislation context in the UK and specifically about the policy of dispersal and its effects. Before we get to that, we just need to set out that immigration policy in Scotland is determined by the Westminster Government, so it is a reserved matter. Nonetheless, successive Scottish administrations have attempted to provide more humane responses to refugee movement, including a commitment to integration from day one of arrival, as opposed to integration beginning from refugee status determination, as is practised by the Westminster Government. However, because immigration is a reserved matter for the UK Government, Westminster, the hostile environment and hierarchies of deservingness cast a long shadow over Scotland and Glasgow's solidarity. In the UK, dispersal has been used as a mechanism of immigration management and has been a feature of immigration legislation, particularly in the resettlement of refugees through quota regimes. However, it was enshrined as a central immigration management tool in the 1999 Immigration and Asylum Act. People in the UK asylum system were subject to dispersal around the UK in order to receive government support. The legislative intention was to avoid overburdening, in inverted commas, with the obligation of supporting people in the asylum process. And there is a twofold rationale behind dispersal as a policy. One, to relieve pressure, and particularly in housing areas in the southeast of England, so to spread the burden. And secondly, it's part of a logic of asylum governance, which argues that fast and firm processing of claims means there is no need for existing social ties. So a forced relocation on a no-choice basis removes people from kinship and social networks, leading to their further marginalisation and longer-term social exclusion. And we can see on this map the dispersal regions, and what you may notice, there's only one in Scotland. So under the Section 95 of the Immigration and Asylum Act 1999, people seeking asylum can apply for support while waiting for their claim or their appeal to be considered. And support can be accommodation and/or subsistence according to their circumstances, and on condition that they satisfy a destitution test. Dispersal, when it was first introduced, and since, has created a new social geography in dispersal areas, where you have a settlement of high numbers of people arriving from countries with a weak, if any, settlement history in the UK, in predominantly white housing estates. Now, at the time, this raised concerns over so-called cultural compatibility and concerns over encapsulated migrant communities and a fracturing of multicultural society, despite the lack of any evidence to support these concerns. Dispersal policy is one part of a formally segregated welfare support system, which removed people in the asylum process entirely from mainstream welfare services. And support for people in the asylum process is minimum. It amounts to roughly about £38 per week. A support level that is widely recognised as one that leads to people experiencing poverty. And for someone refused asylum, who are considered appeals right exhausted, they receive support on a cashless prepaid card that is intended to pay for food, clothing and toiletries. When it was first introduced, local authorities could opt in to become dispersal areas. And because it's an accommodation-led policy driven by availability of housing and not by social needs, dispersal sites themselves are often areas of multiple deprivations with vacant, poor quality housing. Dispersal also offered a substantial role for private housing market, as well as being a driving force behind further privatisation of services, including the busing of dispersed people to dispersal sites, the emergence of housing providers who are tendering for housing contracts, private interpreting services, and lawyers. And it's important just to think here a little bit that dispersal is not a fixed process, but is quite fluid, and it's purposefully designed to disrupt over and over again, because when people are moved, it's not just the packing up of belongings, but if they have children, it's the changing of schools to when they're moved to wherever housing is available. And as we'll go on to explore, this poses important challenges for organisations supporting people in the asylum processes, as well as for refugees and other migrants, all people who are directly affected by the non-integrative functions of dispersal. Since 2001, around 10% of overall UK asylum applicants have been dispersed to Glasgow, and Glasgow is the top dispersal site in the UK. An important myth surrounding asylum migration has been and continues to be that people in the asylum process are really economic migrants in disguise, chasing economic betterment by accessing the provisions of the British welfare state. And the setting up of a segregated welfare support system put paid to this myth. In relation to welfare support, asylum seekers or people who are claiming asylum are excluded from the labour market and cannot claim mainstream benefits. The Immigration Act 2016 merits a little bit more attention here because it cut financial aid and accommodation support for people whose asylum claim had been refused, and curtailed the scope for people who had been refused even further. In the UK, people in the asylum process had been supported via luncheon vouchers and cash. Then vouchers were reintroduced for hard case support, so people considered appeals right exhausted. And then they have been supported by the Azure payment card and now the Aspen card, which are prepaid cashless cards. And these mechanisms, the UK Border Agency claims, helps them to, in inverted commas, cut down on the abuse of asylum support and provide a more efficient system. And what they achieve for the Home Office is the enabling of a wider dispersal, as applicants are not tied to a single post office for collection of asylum support. They allow for a quicker process for obtaining a replacement card and reducing the number of critical failure points. But really what they also help the Home Office do is monitor card usage data. And this is a real concern that's been highlighted by, amongst others, the Unity Centre. And I'll go on to talk about the Unity Centre shortly. But the Unity Centre, which is a radical no borders network and support organisations for people in the asylum process, argue that these mechanisms of providing access to welfare all work towards enabling the Home Office to monitor and scrutinise people in the asylum process even more than they already do. So this means the Home Office can monitor where people spend their money, how they spend, and this may be used against them at a later stage. So we have a kind of perfect storm of compulsory dispersal, no choice housing, the withdrawal of the right to work and of support, prolonged processing times, and the use of destitution and detention as key tools of deterrence. And this produces a dehumanising context designed to force people into destitution, leave them with no access to social security benefits and no ways to support themselves. And this present context of deception, where the narrative of hostility is really, really sharp, has gone further to exclude people in the asylum process over any other category of migrant. So what's interesting about Glasgow is that we are able to trace and connect current migrant solidarity with a much wider and longer history of everyday struggles and crises that have shaped the city. And there are many examples of this historically and contemporary examples of powerful do-it-yourself activism in response to the unjust and punitive treatment of people in the asylum process. And I'm going to just very briefly touch on some of these, but many of these examples can be found in the storyboard. So these include the Glasgow Girls campaign of Drumchapel High School, which was a dispersal neighbourhood where teenage school pupils campaigned against the Home Office and the detention of their friends who were disappearing through dawn raids. The Glasgow campaign to welcome refugees emerged in 2001 with an aim to improve the quality of life of people in the asylum process, with the backing of various trade unions and politicians from several parties and huge numbers of local people. The Unity Centre, based minutes from the UK's Home Office's main Glasgow reporting centre, where people in the asylum process are expected to report either daily, weekly or monthly, gives practical support and solidarity to people in the asylum process and other migrants in Scotland, and their collective action has resulted in substantial changes to the treatment of asylum seekers and contributes to public debate in Scotland being less hostile. Destitution is a growing crisis in Glasgow, and although actual figures are hard to confirm, organisations like the Glasgow Night Shelter for Destitute Asylum Seekers provides emergency overnight accommodation for people in the asylum process, for non-EU migrants and other people with no recourse to public funds who are blocked from accessing homeless services due to their various situations. Ubuntu Women's Shelter is a Glasgow-based charity that started in 2018, aiming to support women facing forced destitution and dehumanisation. They're a specialist service run and managed by people with lived experience of migration, asylum or destitution, and are defined similarly to Unity Centre by a no borders ethos and refusal to consent with the current border regime. And another excellent example is the campaigning work of Living Rent, a tenants' rights association around the enforced Serco lock changes, where Serco, a housing provider, was locking people out of their homes if they had come to the end of the asylum process. And for long-standing groups involved in helping migrants, much of their work has remained unchanged since 2000. The spectacle of the 2015 crisis in Europe led to a reactivation of different practices, for sure, offering new opportunities for people in those communities, collectively and individually, as well as for organisations working with people to rethink and reshape their forms of solidarity. Two examples to highlight here are Maryhill Integration Network and Govan Community Project, of long-standing grassroots organising that has evolved over time, providing more formalised casework support, social activities and advocacy and campaigning work. So we can see here that resistance has been extended to include injustices to all migrants and citizens in its focus on fighting structural inequalities, with solidarity and common cause as a call for transformative action. The case of Glasgow points to practices of resistance and solidarity that are shaped by and connected to people, to memory, to time and to place. And in Glasgow, solidarity is practiced as part of the cityscape and comes to be narrated as central to the city's identity. So given Glasgow's status as a top dispersal city in the UK, exploring the Glasgow context provides some opportunities for thinking through how we might reconnect a practice of resistance and solidarity at a local level across different dimensions of immigration. And just this final point here, that what resistance and solidarity mean and how they are enacted is as varied as the actors who evoke it. And we believe that in a city like Glasgow, history and place really offer particularly effective insights for understanding processes of resistance and processes of solidarity. So we hope that this overview gives an introduction to the city. And really, we want you to watch this and then go to the digital storyboard and look at some of the case studies of those organisations who are pushing back against the current processes of exclusion and degradation that we're seeing in cities like Glasgow, but also across the UK.